Not a lot of people online or anything. I'm actually honestly considering ah, just got a message from my landlord, sorry. Been having trouble with my coolant house. It's like a little flat thingy that does the plunger thing, that thing. I'm like, yeah, it's not working right. And it's a week to come over to my house. He just texted me. He's like, well, I can't get it to do what you're saying that it does. Make sure some plumber and not come over yourself. It's like he has to verify. Oh yeah, no, I'm making it up for the purposes of having you spend money on a plumber just because I so I guess so it is. Man, landlord stuff. Tried to explain to him what the issue is. Whatever. Put it out of my mind. I'll deal with that later. But anyway, so today we're going to finish up Nietzsche. Of course, this is the last time that I'll be seeing you, and of course, your final exam is going to commence on basically Saturday morning, and you have until the end of Tuesday to take that exam. And in case you need it, I also have study guide. Anybody like a copy? I may have given this out last week. I can't remember, but did you want one? It is online, but it's always nice to have a hard copy. And I think I talked about it last time, but the short version is, of course, you have this 4-day window during which you can access the exam, 3 hours long. The multiple choice will be integrated within the exam, but you'll have like a separate worksheet that you'll access in a separate window somewhere on Blackboard. I'll stick that. Look at the short answers, decide what you're going to choose the essays that you want to choose, and just put it into Blackboard. And I'm thinking that I'll probably make it something kind of like sort of like you have one blank space and you just kind of hit submit and it takes you to another response area. I don't know. I guess some people have opinions on how they like these things to be structured, but I kind of like the whole sequential thing. It also kind of ensures that should something happen, you're saving answers as you go, right? As opposed to like putting them all in. And if you don't like hit the save button, it could like knock you out, and then you don't save any of your responses, right? Some people are like, well, I like to sometimes go back and change answers, and I'm like, well, don't, because usually when people do that, they get it more wrong. Like, your first instinct's probably the best, and go ahead and work on one thing and just kind of move on. So I don't know. I'll see how I end up structuring that. But you got 3 hours. Should any kind of, distractions occur, you got to step away for a moment, or maybe your computer freezes. Well, you got plenty of time. Again, like as long as you've saved the answers, they're going to be recorded. And if you get kicked out, you can always go back into the exam, right? But again, leaving the exam does not stop the timer. The 3 hours is 3 hours. It goes whether you're in there or not. Okay? Everybody clear on that? So just make sure you're budgeting your time. I don't know if it's had a big impact on people, but I've heard through the grapevine that some professors, I don't know, are doing weird things because, like, well, maybe they had plans for Monday or Tuesday and they're rearranging things. Well, hopefully this doesn't affect anything because we've been planning on this, for a long time. But the short story is my advice to you, just don't put yourself in a situation where you're trying to knock this thing out Tuesday night. Plan ahead and say, this is when I'm going to do this. And set aside the time to do it. Okay. All right. But anyway, talking about Nietzsche, where we left off, last time in the last lecture, we were talking about this section 341 from the Gay Science called The Greatest Weight. And, I'll give a little bit of a review to sort of set us up. Again, this is from the first handout. Near the end, right? And it occurs immediately after this section called The Dying Socrates. So just to kind of remind us a little bit of Nietzsche's overarching analysis. Like, if we want to sort of take us as a starting point, Nietzsche's, sort of philosophical analysis, right? He basically sort of takes for granted that, like, God is dead. But again, we've talked about how this phrase means something a little bit more than a lot of the simplicity that's been attributed to it, right? It's basically about nihilism, which Nietzsche thinks is it's sort of like the modern cultural diagnosis. That is, that the belief in God through a series of advancements in modern science is just something, that people just either don't believe in at all, or it doesn't really mean anything to them, or it just occupies a very, very small part of their lives that just isn't really significant. Because he's basically suggesting that through the advent of modern science and, of course, the progression of modern philosophy, and, you can extend this analysis, as many people after Nietzsche have, just like sort of the overall technological developments. We live in so much more of a modernized world. A lot of the mystery of the world has been kind of taken away. I enjoy reading Greek mythology. This may sound like a weird thing to do, but my 6-year-old, I've been trying to read him increasingly complex stuff for bedtime story, partly for my fun, so that I'm not just reading like, Goodnight Moon all the time, and also partly for educational purposes, but also partly if it's kind of dry, he goes to sleep pretty quickly. But I've been reading Homer's Odysseus, which I know sounds kind of like heavy-handed, but he actually kind of likes it because there's a lot of violence and cyclops slaying and things like that. So, it's actually pretty cool. But I'm fascinated reading to the Greeks, and I mentioned sort of this when we were talking about them at the beginning of the semester. They thought gods were everywhere, always working through us. And sometimes I think to myself, like, what would it be like to live in such a world? That, like, literally, it's like, when you're drinking, you don't just think about, like, today, modern science, we know how alcohol works and goes into the bloodstream and yada, yada, yada. But rather, no, Dionysus through the wine is actually possessing you, right? Or something like that. Or, well, I'm sexually attracted to this person because it's physiologically sound. No, it's Eros, the god, is working through you, right? Just like, so it's just like a whole reality is completely imbued with spirituality and godliness. And now, think about modern humans. We're pretty cynical, right? Oh, yeah, I know many of us believe in God. But how much does that really impact or influence our daily lives? And again, remember, Nietzsche, a philologist, this guy is somebody who studies a lot of ancient culture. So he's sort of comparing, modernity to antiquity. And he says, what does God still mean to us? And again, what he's interested is the nihilism that this is ultimately bringing about. And we talked about how that's leading to a form of pessimism. Okay? And of course, pessimism is about, like, what is the value of existence? Is it something valuable at all? But remember, for Nietzsche, the nihilism that he thinks is coupled with the death of God is something that isn't brought about entirely coincidentally. It's something that was, for Nietzsche, inevitable to happen on the basis of the value, the moral, the philosophical, and the religious foundations of Western society, right? We talked about, our sort of, triangle of Western culture, right? Let's call it like, philosophy. And of course, he's thinking of Plato as the head here. Dual world metaphysics. Okay? And then on the other hand, Christianity, with the idea of, God and heaven over here, right? And then, of course, world and, sin down here. It's just another version of, duality. But, it ultimately culminates in a kind of moral value judgment. And, just a quick comment. You see Nietzsche criticizing, morality a lot. And, in his books, are, of course, they try to be as incendiary as they possibly can. Like, for example, one of his titles of his books is, Beyond Good and Evil. So it's sort of like, oh, he wants us to get beyond good and evil. Wow. Or, an earlier work, Morgenröte, which is daybreak or dawn of day, like dawn of a new day. The subtitle is Thoughts on the Prejudices of Morality. And, so it almost sounds like, wow, is this guy just basically sort of advancing an idea that we should all just like be mean to one another, or just like lie, cheat, and steal, or just kill? Is it kind of like what Dostoevsky writes in this great 19th century novel, The Brothers Karamazov? If there was no God, then all is permitted, right? Is that kind of what Nietzsche's getting at? The way that I like to sort of think about Nietzsche and morality, let's think about morality as not merely like a set of commandments, as like, do this or do that, don't do this, do this. But he sees it as like, let's call it the moral perspective, almost like a worldview. Remember, for Nietzsche, so many of the things that we would usually attribute a kind of an objective reality or some sort of intrinsic truth, Nietzsche sees them merely as perspectives, as lenses through which we interpret an otherwise value neutral reality. He thinks that morality isn't so much about an objective truth or falsity, but it's a perspective, it's an interpretation. And what is the moral perspective? Viewing all actions and even the world itself in these binary kind of categories, right? The idea being, that, this is good and that is bad, or this is evil. And you can even think about that a lot. Like, when people think morality is on their side, they don't really have to argue or debate. They don't really have to listen to what the other guy has to say. Because if you've already pinned somebody up as being evil or bad, then there's only one response: to get rid of the wicked. The other view is not something that's going to be compatible if God or morality is on your side. And of course, what Nietzsche's thinking is that, moral categories are ultimately being applied through these religious and metaphysical perspectives. Moral categories are being placed upon the very value of life and existence itself. And what's the moral perspective? Again, informed by the dual world metaphysics as well as religion, particularly in the form of Christianity. And again, you might say, well, look, I don't think Christianity is all like kind of doom and gloom. And maybe that's true. But doesn't it have at least a little bit of strand of that? Even, Jesus is all well and good, but sometimes when you think about some of the ideas from the Sermon on the Mount, right? There's going to be a time when the last is first and the first will be last, or the last will be first and the first will be last, right? Blessed are the meek, they'll inherit the earth. And it's kind of the idea that this world, in its evil and its suffering and its sin and badness, is ultimately going to be overcome. There'll be a day of reckoning for all the people I don't like, I don't disagree with. This world's going to go away and the promised one's going to come back. And again, what's kind of the whole idea here? Life negation. Again, you can see how for Nietzsche, none of this stuff has to do with any objective or intrinsic view or reality. Nietzsche's basic perspective begins with, a quasi-nihilist perspective, insofar as, like I called it, epistemological nihilism. Just the notion that, existence, reality, it's just value neutral. But these are imposed meanings in order to give us a sense of purpose. Remember that aphorism we looked at last time, the teachers of the purpose of existence. What makes life worth living? Well, it's kind of interesting because if the meaning that you construct in order to make life worth living is one that is fundamentally sort of negating this life in favor of a beyond, then it's exerting a negative value judgment upon this world. But of course, the significance of the death of God, again, increasing secularism, increasing the progression of modern science. If God is dead, the meaning that has made this whole sort of theoretical paradigm work is gone. You're only left with the bad physical realm, but no metaphysical payoff to make it all worthwhile. So you're left with the moral philosophical religious categories that besmirch and condemn this life in favor of beyond, but with no payoff. And that's the essence of nihilism. And that's what Nietzsche sort of seeks to overcome. But again, it's not necessarily all doom and gloom. We have an opportunity to overcome it. And just before we look at section 341 again, I want to highlight section 107, an earlier section from the first handout in the Gay Science. And this gives a sense of, kind of like Nietzsche's perspective here, what he's ultimately working toward. Section 107, our ultimate gratitude toward art. Art? Is art going to play a role here? Well, of course. Remember last time we talked about the very title of the work. It alludes to poetry. Nietzsche sees himself almost more of an artist than a philosopher. But anyway, section 107. If we had not welcomed the arts and invented this kind of cult of the untrue, then the realization of general untruth and mendaciousness that now comes to us through science, the realization that delusion and error are conditions of human knowledge and sensation, this would be utterly unbearable. Honesty would lead to nausea and suicide. Just before I continue, what do you think he means by this idea that the realization of general untruth and mendaciousness that comes to us through science, the realization that delusion and error are conditions of human knowing, human knowledge and sensation, this would be utterly unbearable. What does he mean by delusion and error are conditions of human knowledge and sensation? What do you think he means by that? Well, I alluded earlier to Nietzsche's basic sort of critique. He calls it the revaluations of all values. Now, it's important to note that for Nietzsche, any truth claim, when we claim that we have some sort of knowledge about truth or whatever, it's ultimately a value claim. That, Nietzsche sort of thinks that anytime that we give an interpretation claiming truth to the world as we perceive it, we're imposing a kind of a value upon it. The language through which we even talk about things betrays a certain kind of value set. It's important to get his point here, and to kind of turn to another aphorism. Consider section 109 from the Gay Science, where he says, "Let us beware." This is the section that immediately follows the first time that he says God is dead in section 108. Let us beware of thinking that the world is a living being. Where should it expand? On what should it feed? How could it grow and multiply? We have some notion of the nature of the organic, and we should not reinterpret the exceedingly derivative, late, rare, and accidental that we perceive only on the crust of the earth and make it something essential, universal, and eternal. This is what those people do who call the universe an organism. This nauseates me. Let us even beware of believing that the universe is a machine. It is certainly not constructed for one purpose, and calling it a machine does it far too much honor. We talked earlier about either a teleological interpretation of the universe, right? Seeing it as a kind of organism striving to actualize some kind of latent purpose. And then we talked about the mechanistic worldview of the Enlightenment ushered in by Descartes, right? That the world is a machine. And Nietzsche's saying, let us beware of talking about the universe in either of those kind of categories. Why? It's imposing a kind of an order and structure upon the world itself. But insofar as we are interpreting that structure of the universe, it is simply hopelessly the product of what? An interpretation from our very finite perspective. We project our own mental categories upon an otherwise value-neutral existence, and we attribute it some sort of order in nature, but it's only our finite human interpretation. This is why Nietzsche is kind of like Kant radicalized. Remember how Kant said that the very laws of nature are products of the human mental categories that structure and organize our experience for us? Does that ring a bell? Nietzsche's kind of like, well, I mean, if our entire interpretation of nature is based only upon subjective mental categories, then it's kind of like, again, not only Kant radicalized, but Hume radicalized. Then I guess it's like every single truth that we attribute to nature is only on the basis of our very finite and individual perspective. So when we talk about the order of nature, we only believe that there's order because we're projecting order onto nature. It's just hopelessly individual interpretation. But let's go back to his earlier claim. Every truth claim is a value claim. So when we interpret certain truths of nature, we're actually interpreting it through a certain kind of perspective. And that perspective is laden with value judgment, even in a potentially unconscious way. He continues, let us beware of positing generally and everywhere anything as elegant as the cyclical movements of our neighboring stars. Even a glance into the Milky Way raises doubts whether there are not far coarser and more contradictory movements there, as well as stars with eternally linear paths, and etc. And he, just skipping a few lines down, the total character of the world, however, is in all eternity chaos, in the sense not of a lack of necessity. He's like, I'm not tearing apart the laws of nature here, but I'm saying in the sense of a lack of order, arrangement, form, beauty, wisdom, and whatever other names there are for our aesthetic anthropomorphisms. And that's perhaps the key phrase here. Aesthetic anthropomorphisms. What does that mean? Aesthetic, relates to things like beauty, particularly in the category of art. An anthropomorphism basically means attributing human-like characteristics to non-human entities. So what is sort of Nietzsche suggesting here? When we talk about the order of nature, or laws of nature, or the beauty or grandeur of nature, what are we doing? We're projecting human mental categories onto an otherwise indifferent nature only from our own finite perspective. And the aesthetic aspect of it is we do so because it is pleasing to us. But what Nietzsche is suggesting is that we forget that all the projections that we attribute onto nature in its order, form, necessity, and beauty are all only limited, finite human interpretations. But let's go even further here. As soon as we interpret laws of nature, or nature to have some sort of laws don't come from nowhere. Laws are given by a kind of law giver. If there is order in nature, then the assumption is that the order is the product of some kind of greater entity. Nietzsche thinks that even our scientific, philosophical, and logical categories through which we interpret science and nature are the product of an entire 2,000-year tradition, a philosophical, religious, scientific, moral tradition that ultimately assumes that there is the world that we perceive and a kind of higher order to reality upon which this world is based. But insofar as you posit a beyond that makes this world possible, what is Nietzsche suggesting that you're doing? You're doing so at the expense of this world, life negation. So the project of the revaluation of all values demands that we literally dismantle and take apart all the ways that we think about and consider reality, all the way down to the very language that we use to describe it. As he says at the bottom of 168, in section 109 again. When shall we ever be done with our caution and care? When will all these shadows of God cease to darken our minds? When will we complete our deification of nature? When may we begin to naturalize humanity in terms of a pure, newly discovered, newly redeemed nature? To take the otherworldliness out of the perspectives through which we view reality and existence is going to take quite a lot of work. An entire perspectival shift, a revaluation of all values. But Nietzsche's optimistic. Now, going back to that section I was looking at earlier, 107, if we had not welcomed the arts and invented this kind of cult of the untrue, then the realization of general untruth and mendaciousness that now comes to us through science, the realization that delusion and error are conditions of human knowledge and sensation, would be utterly unbearable. So again, why is delusion and error conditions of human knowledge? Because all human knowledge is predicated upon the delusion and error that we can have some kind of objective knowledge about the world, but in fact, it is simply only always our limited perspective which is projected onto the world. But once we realize this, oh, wait a minute, there is no higher truth, there is no higher order, and all the ways that I interpret the world are nothing more than finite human categories, I guess that means everything is just hopeless and meaningless. That's why he says honesty would lead to nausea and suicide. Why? Because there's no purpose to existence. But he says now there is a counterforce against our honesty that would help us avoid such consequences, art as the goodwill to appearance. We do not always keep our eyes from rounding off something and, as it were, finishing the poem. Then it is no longer eternal imperfection that we carry across the river of becoming. That's a nice phrase. What does that mean? It is no longer eternal imperfection that we carry across the river of becoming. Well, becoming. Actually, Tyler, you should know what that means, the river of becoming, because you're in my ancient class, not to pick upon you. When I hear words like becoming and river, who's a philosopher that comes to mind? The one who emphasized becoming, how it's like a river. Ring any bells?
Is it recent or was it a while ago?
It was in the beginning of the semester. Those brain cells have long died, I guess. I'm sorry. Well, that would be Heraclitus. Remember him? The becoming guy. You can't step in the same river twice. There you go. If you recall, Plato also divided reality into two halves. And what were they? Being and becoming. And becoming was the what? The physical and the change. But of course, Plato negated the becoming in favor of the being. And in so doing, he judged it. He wanted to do away with it. But what is Nietzsche suggesting? Again, it is no longer eternal imperfection that we carry across the river, borrowing that Heraclitean motif, the river of becoming. We can restore innocence to nature. It is not something bad. It is not something to be overcome. It is not what limits humanity. It is our humanity. But how is it that we can overcome 2,000 years of an intellectual and moral and religious tradition that has taught us nothing other than the fact that life is bad? By turning not to philosophy or science, but to art. And he says that as an aesthetic phenomenon, existence is still bearable for us. And art furnishes us with eyes and hands and above all the good conscience to be able to turn ourselves into such a phenomenon. What does that mean? As an aesthetic phenomenon, existence is still bearable for us. If it is true that there is no higher order in value to existence, rather than falling into a nihilistic pessimism and just saying, well, there's no meaning, so I guess woe is me. Why not take that as an opportunity to make existence itself into a blank canvas upon which you can make your work of art? Create meaning out of a meaningless world. But rather than creating a meaning that does away with the reality of this world, a meaning that affirms this reality in all of its contradiction and suffering and badness. Can we create a meaning out of a meaningless world that can, A, be something that we recognize as a human creation and still take it seriously because it doesn't come from a beyond, and B, that meaning remains faithful to this world as opposed to projecting meaning onto some kind of gaseous beyond, whether it be forms, heaven, soul, God, all that kind of stuff. That's what Nietzsche suggested. But in order to do that, we have to overcome our entire moral, intellectual, and religious tradition, which he sees as fundamentally antagonistic to life itself, which is why he says at the end of this section, we should be able to stand above morality. Again, not just being mean to people or anything like that, but the entire moral perspective through which we automatically judge this world in terms of moral categories. And not only to stand with the anxious stiffness of a man who is afraid of slipping and falling at any moment, but also to float above it and play. So, Nietzsche thinks, as he puts it in Zarathustra a little bit later, not by wrath does one kill, but by laughter. If you really want to overcome a tradition, you don't wrangle with it by being vengeful and spiteful, but you laugh at its ridiculousness, which is why, again, gay science, it's through laughter that we overcome. How then could we possibly dispense with art and with the fool, as long as you are in any way ashamed before yourselves, you do not yet belong with us. I love how Nietzsche's like, we got a club and us. Do you belong with us? He's quite a writer, right? But of course, what he means is, what does it mean to say that if you're ashamed before yourself, you do not yet belong with us? Well, if all of this sounds a little bit scary and bad, wow, this guy's pretty hardcore. Nietzsche says, well, you're not ready yet for the project that I'm working upon. May as well close the book and walk away. His one of his earlier works that's sort of quintessentially Nietzschean is a work called Human All Too Human, and the subtitle is called. It was a book for free spirits. Nietzsche often likes to talk about how he's writing not for all, but the free spirits, the free thinkers, the philosophers of the future. His book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is subtitled A Book for Alle und Keinen, All and None, a book for everybody but nobody. What does that mean? He feels that he has an audience out there, but they may not yet exist. And that's who Nietzsche thinks that he's ultimately writing for. So, of course, we have a question now. What kind of artistic perspective ought we to adopt that would lead us to this revaluation of all values and make us well positioned to reject old values and adopt ones that are of a more life-affirming character? Because it's life affirmation that Nietzsche is ultimately trying to seek. Well, that leads us back to section 341, where he writes at the end of the Gay Science, first edition anyway, what if some day or night a demon were to steal after you in your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence, even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. So we have a little thought experiment here. He's not putting this forth as like a strong metaphysical postulate, but it's really just a question. And how you respond to this question is meant to be a sort of test as to whether you are one of the ashamed or one of the free spirits. And what is he asking? He says, look, what if when you die, it's not the case that you either, I guess, there's two major, camps of thinking on this. I'm going to oversimplify that you either just go night-night a long time, just eternal sleep, just nothing, bloop, that's it. Or you go to some kind of beyond, whether it be reincarnation, or you can call it heaven, or maybe hell if you're not so good. But the point is there's something after this world, right? Because there's something more. But what if that isn't what happens when you die? But rather, it's like life hits the reset button, and you just live your life over again. But it's not going to be a Groundhog Day situation. Y'all seen that movie, right? Where, it's like you realize, oh, I'm repeating my life over again. I've been here before, deja vu. No. It's just like right now. Doesn't feel like you've been here before, but let's say that you actually have been infinite number of times. And when you die, your life's just going to start over again. Same one down to the finest details. It's just going to happen over and over again for infinity. So, Nietzsche calls this, again, the eternal recurrence. It's not really meant as something he literally believes is the actual truth of reality and existence. But it's something that he thinks that is a perspective that we should consider to adopt. Most ways of thinking, and it's kind of interesting the way that Nietzsche weaves together both secular scientific thinking as well as religious thinking. But there's like a beginning in time, okay? All right, call it the Big Bang, call it the unmoved mover, call it God, whatever. But here we go, shooting onward and upward because time is a progression. We're moving towards something. What are we moving toward? Well, if you're religious, it's going to be the apocalypse, the end of time, the resurrection, God's coming back down, all that sort of stuff. Or maybe you're a scientist and you just think, well, it's kind of, again, the end of the world mythology. Philosophers of religion and theologians call this an eschatology. So all religions have some form of eschatological myth, aka some story about how the world's going to end. But it's interesting because even modern cosmology and physics basically say that the universe is finite. So at some point there's going to be a big collapse or a big freeze or a big bust or some, there's all kinds of fun little names. They basically think that, for example, if the universe is expanding, at some point, it's going to expand to the point that like any kind of like, energy or motion is just going to cease and everything's just going to stop. But guess what? Whether you are religious or scientific, there's basically a story, and the story is the same. The universe has a beginning, and it's just all going to stop. Everything's going to die out one of these days, and then there's going to be nothing. Or if you're religious, there's going to be everything. But Nietzsche said, what if everybody's wrong? And it is simply the case that time is like a giant circle. You may have heard of the old image of the Ouroboros, which is the one of the snake eating its own tail. In ancient, I believe its origins are Egyptian. And that was basically what some ancient cultures thought, was that it was the case that simply time is circular. And so not merely are you going to repeat your own existence again, down to the finest detail, but all things will eternally recur for infinity. Now, Nietzsche's question, of course, is what do you think about that? How does that make you feel? Sleepy? It makes you feel sleepy? Okay. But how does that make you feel? Anybody? You.
So you said it's like you just don't recall it though?
No, yeah, you don't recall it.
Would I have an opinion on it? Or just keep the video about it?
Well, do you have an opinion on it? Okay, well, Nietzsche would say you're pretty nihilistic. because you are apathetic to whether or not there is an afterlife, a God, or a heaven, or a beyond. You're like, whatever. None of it really matters anyway. So you're a nihilist. That's fine. Um, does anybody have any kind of opinion, or are we all just basically like, whatever? Maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't. Maybe I'll sleep a long time, maybe it don't. Give me 3 hots and a cot and a burger, and I'm fine. Well, you were right, Nietzsche. God truly is dead. Well, I guess we can all pack up and go home then. Does anybody think that's not very cool? Well, say something about that.
Well, it'd kind of be, it honestly kind of be a little bit relieving knowing though there is no heaven or hell. It'd also be kind of like, well, this kind of sucks.
Right. Okay. All those kind of stories are true, or not true. But yeah, this is it. So this right now is it. It is your life on infinite repeat. There's no hope for either going to sleep a long time, like infinity, passing into the nothingness or the void. There's no hope for like reincarnation. There's no hope for heaven or hell. It's just this is it.
No sweet release of death.
No sweet release of death. That is right. And what Nietzsche's sort of getting at is how you respond says everything about you. You could just be sort of apathetic to it, but that gets, Nietzsche's kind of point in that, that's the nihilism of modernity, which doesn't necessarily express itself in existential angst, but just kind of apathy, just being like, whatever. But Nietzsche thinks that's almost as bad as the other response, which would be, that sounds horrible. What do you mean? This is all that there is? This can't be all that there is because, we've already said that in a lot of ways, life kind of sucks. And it's just going to keep sucking forever. And there's no more. That's it. Well, Nietzsche says that while those are possible responses, what he's working toward, and it's kind of interesting because he advocates for others to join him, but in many ways, when you read Nietzsche, it almost sounds like his own personal quest. But the idea is he sees himself as an exemplar that others should consider. Because what Nietzsche's saying is that I would say once more and innumerable times more. There's a musical phrase, da capo, Italian, once again, from the top. Do it innumerable times more. And he says, one response is, or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, you are a god and never have I heard anything more divine. If this thought gained possession of you, it would change you as you are or perhaps crush you. The question in each and everything, do you desire this once more and innumerable times more, would lie upon your actions as the greatest weight. Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to crave nothing more fervently than this ultimate eternal confirmation and seal? Nietzsche sees the embrace of the eternal recurrence, not literally something that you know is true, but something you would want to be true, something that you would affirm and crave as the ultimate expression of life affirmation. Because it is a different path than either, nihilistic atheism that just says, well, we're all just going to die and just nothing's going to happen. But isn't that its own form of escapism? Because at least if you're dead and you go into nothingness, you got a way out. Or on the other hand, you can, go to heaven or go to some other plane of existence and, be one with the forms or one with God or whatever. But that's the other way out. Most of humanity sees that there's some way out, there's some kind of end, there's an escape to this life because their truest, deepest value judgment is that it's no good. But if we embrace our life, as well as all of existence, of course, that's a pretty big ask because you're kind of like, well, we got to do the Nazis over again. We got to do Trump over again. We got to do, the genocide of American Indians over again. We got to do like coronavirus over again. Got to do middle school again. That's right. And that's what he's asking is to think to your darkest moments. Could you will them over again for infinity? Because he thinks it is only through even the negative and the positive that makes you who you are. And only when you become that well disposed to yourself are you truly one who has overcome nihilism. Is such a perspective possible? Nietzsche thinks it is. And the interesting thing is for him to write these things and believe these things is quite interesting. Recall, Nietzsche had a pretty tough life. I mean, he was successful for a while as an academic, but his health took a bad turn. And, his eyesight got really, really bad. He had really bad headaches. He couldn't sleep. He had stomach issues, vomiting, and indigestion. And he was forced to retire his academic life. And he never really had a permanent home. He just traveled and lived in boarding houses and just wrote all the time. His face pressed almost against the page due to his poor eyesight. And even the act of writing itself gave him tremendous headaches due to the poor eyesight and his overall poor health condition. His sister, whom he loved, ended up marrying an anti-Semite fanatic and going to Paraguay to found a colony, an Aryan purity colony. All his friends were sort of abandoning him because they saw him as a radical and almost crazy with all of his ideas about critiques of God and society and Western culture. But you know what he said? Once more and innumerable times more, I would will it over and over and again. So even his own kind of rough life, he said, look, this is my way. Show me yours. If I can do it, so can you. It's a kind of an interesting example. In some ways, that perspective, Nietzsche's own perspective, and you can kind of get the sense, right, that Nietzsche's philosophy is very individualistic, and it's almost like an expression of himself, but he sees himself as an example of individualism, inviting others to, embrace their own ways, right? Doesn't really make a lot of sense to call somebody a Nietzschean, because he would say, only when you deny me are you truly going to ever follow me, right? That, it's not my job to be your teacher. It's my job to turn you into your own teacher. But of course, it requires a lot of work to shed all the values and constraints of society. But anyway, Nietzsche writes a work called Thus Spoke Zarathustra. A fascinating experiment in literature and philosophy in order to give a kind of, parable, kind of a series of speeches, basically a story of the journey of recognizing the eternal recurrence, life affirmation, and offering what it would look like to undertake the system of, or the project of the revaluation of all values. And I want to talk about that a little bit before we go. Zarathustra, well, for one thing, what's up with this name? Zarathustra is actually the name of an ancient Persian prophet, a religious leader. He's the founder of, the Greeks called him Zoroaster. And he's the founder of a very ancient world religion called Zoroastrianism, which was popular in the Middle East, really all the way up until, of course, Islam eventually overtook it. But the idea in this very ancient religion, Zarathustra, taught that reality was basically like a kind of a binary. There were two dueling forces that exist, the force of lightness and darkness. Of course, lightness was the force of good, and darkness was the force of evil. And our existence, is basically caught in this sort of cosmic struggle. And the purpose of human life is to try to, seek good as much as we can and avoid evil as much as we can. And that's kind of the basic gist of it. And Nietzsche says that Zarathustra then, and he's sort of like in his own alternate history, basically saying this is the first world religion. This is the first prophet who taught of viewing the world through moral categories, that there is this absolute good and absolute evil, and that therefore we're being judged in this world and we aren't truly liberated. Well, the thing is Nietzsche imagines that this, again, and this is all like, literary and allegorical, not truly history, but the name comes from this actual prophet. But at the age of 30, Zarathustra goes up to a mountain for 10 years and he meditates and decides that all of his teaching was wrong. So Zarathustra now has a new teaching. And guess what the new teaching is? Nietzsche's teaching. So Zarathustra becomes a kind of an alter ego of Nietzsche to put forth his own views in a kind of a highly literary garb. But it's kind of fascinating because it's imbued, it is seething with biblical allusions. It even reads kind of like the Bible or some sort of mythical or religious text. But the irony is it's like a quasi-religion that is against all religion insofar as it teaches the death of God. You know, by the way, the significance of the age of Zarathustra, he was about 30. That was supposedly around the age that Jesus, of course, was crucified. So Nietzsche imagines a religious, a scenario or religious leader that doesn't become a martyr, but lives till middle age. And so they got a little bit more mature and they were like, and jaded. And decided to change their mind and that, life was a little bit more complicated than what they originally thought. So Zarathustra goes down to a marketplace, and the most famous part from this work is the prologue, even though in many ways the book, I don't want to say contradicts the prologue, but goes a lot beyond the teachings found there. But you get a good sense of Nietzsche from this prologue. And the whole thing is very literary, and it's sort of important that we keep in mind the literary aspects or the dramatic character. Of course, it's a series of speeches, but it's also a story. So Zarathustra, after 10 years, all looking probably haggard and big beard, looking all crazy, comes down out of the mountains and he goes to a town square. And everybody's gathered in town square because there's apparently going to be a tightrope show. So a tightrope walker is getting ready to do their little thing. And it's kind of interesting because as Zarathustra walks in, he's probably thinking, well, I have all these ideas and I haven't really talked to anybody in 10 years because I'm basically a hermit. How am I going to put into words all the ideas that I have that are going to be really radical and people may not be, really ready to hear? So he uses an image that is convenient to him, the tightrope walker standing above the rest of the other humans. And so his basic teaching is that of here you have the origin of the word. Ubermensch, translated by Kaufmann as overman. Literally, it would mean something like superhuman. Early translations translated it straightforwardly as Superman, but of course, as the comic book character got more popular, we didn't want to imagine the life-affirming revaluer of all valuers in blue tights and a cape, but some people believe that the word Superman in English maybe was influenced by the Nietzschean, Übermensch, just that phrase. Uber, above, beyond, superabundant, mensch, human being. Overman captures you can see it's kind of like, it's got the same ring, Ubermensch, overman. So it kind of is a good translation. But what Nietzsche imagines is that, so Zarathustra is speaking of a future humanity that we aren't presently able to achieve because we're so inundated and indoctrined within our current ways of thinking. But if we work in the project of the revaluation of all values, we can imagine a future kind of humanity that is beyond humanity in its current state. Notice how this isn't a God, right? This isn't any kind of metaphysical projection. It's a future humanity that has basically overcome the life-negating perspectives of classical morality, religion, and philosophy, and has embraced the life-affirming character of the eternal recurrence. That's all that this is about. A lot of ink's been spilled on what Nietzsche means by this, but if you read him closely, it's quite clear what he means by this. So let's see what Zarathustra has to say. So he speaks to the market square. I teach you the overman. Man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? All beings so far have created something beyond themselves. And do you want to be the ebb of this great flood and even go back to the beasts rather than overcome man? What is the ape to man? A laughing stock or a painful embarrassment, and man shall be just that for the overman, a laughingstock, or a painful embarrassment. You have made your way from worm to man, and much in you is still worm. Once you were apes, and even now, too, man is more ape than any ape. So, taking a kind of evolutionary perspective, once we were apes, now we are human beings, and we look to the apes as a laughingstock or a painful embarrassment. We want to believe that we're not apes, but we're more apes than what we truly realize. And that's why the future of humanity will look back upon humanity in its current state as an ape. The way that we consider apes, the Ubermensch will look at us now as mere apes in our current state. Do we not want to, and here's the good aspect of this translation, overcome ourselves? And, overcoming the nihilistic pessimism, not to mention what Nietzsche thinks is sort of the mediocrity of current humanity. We just don't really care that much about anything anymore. Exhibit A, eternal return, take it or leave it. Nietzsche says, look, we have to have passion within ourselves. And the point is, because of the death of God, and because we have basically eroded our beliefs in something beyond ourselves, it's like we've lost any kind of capacity for greatness. We are kind of just a bunch of fat, happy cows. He says later on that the town that Zarathustra went to is the Motley Cow. I love that name. That's the name of the town. Obviously, allegorical. Motley. What is motley? It's kind of like an array, like, an assembly of incongruent, like, things. Like, you would call, like, for example, a patchwork coat motley because of all the various colors that make it up and that sort of thing. What is Nietzsche thinking about? Well, modernity, modern culture, we're kind of a motley assortment of values. We kind of, we got a little bit of pagan, we got a little bit Christian, we got a little bit other things, and we kind of just take values as we like them. But we have no sense of unity because we aren't really committed to any of our values anymore. Just like the motley coat, it's just an adornment that we like to wear in order to make us look pretty, but they don't actually have any internal coherence. We're just kind of like the inheritors of, millennia of the human cultures that came before us, that all, passionately created and believed in the things. Like I was talking about at the beginning of class, Homer talking about Odysseus, that was all real to him, man. Even if he made up the story of Odysseus, he still believed in things like gods and a beyond and all these kind of things. And we kind of inherit all of these cultural traditions, and they inform who we are, but in a way that it's not authentically who we are. We're just like a motley assortment of the various cultural traditions that have come before us. And yet they have no unity or coherence because we've lost the ability to care about anything. Cow, because we don't care about anything. Modern humanity is a bunch of fat, happy, bovine cows. We chew the cud and sit around and say, man, whatever. As long as I got my food and my burr and the happiness of a game or on TV and my phone or my PS5, I'm perfectly happy. What matters, God's in afterlife, as long as I'm happy chewing the cud. Motley cow is Nietzsche's diagnosis of modern humanity. Boom. But Zarathustra wants to shake us out of our bovine contentment, and he says, behold, I teach you the overman. The overman is the meaning of the earth. Let your will say the overman shall be the meaning of the earth. I beseech you, my brothers, remain faithful to the earth. Do not believe those who speak to you of otherworldly hopes. Poison mixers are they, whether they know it or not. Despisers of life are they, decaying and poison themselves, of whom the earth is weary. So let them go. Once the sin against God was the greatest sin, but God died, and these sinners died with him. To sin against the earth is now the most dreadful thing, and to esteem the entrails of the unknowable higher than the meaning of the earth. Now, revaluation of all values. What is sin is not sinning against God, but sinning against life and the earth itself. And if you esteem the entrails of the unknowable, a gaseous beyond, like the forms or the noumena or anything like that, if that's your true will indeed, then you sin against life and the earth itself. So thus Zarathustra almost is teaching a, quote unquote religion but it's a religion about life affirmation as opposed to life negation. But what happens as Zarathustra talks to the market square? Well, you can imagine what happens to him. Just like the madman in section 125 of the Gay Science, they just kind of laugh at him. They're just like, whatever, weirdo, get out of the way. The tightrope walker's about to begin the show. Okay, yeah, overman. And Zarathustra gets all sad, and he's like, thus they cluck like chickens. Thus they yammer. They do not hear with their ears. They do not have the ability to comprehend. So he says, let me appeal to their pride and see if I can try to get them to listen to me. So he teaches them of something that he thinks will get to them. And this is the idea of what he calls the last man. Think about this as a kind of choice. Two ideals of humanity. Last man versus Übermensch or overman. He says, I say unto you, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. I say unto you, you still have chaos in yourself. Alas, the time is coming when man will no longer give birth to a star. Alas, the time of the most despicable man is coming, he that is no longer able to despise himself. By the way, you can't really overcome yourself if you don't first despise yourself. If you're very self-satisfied, then you're pretty happy chewing the cud. Behold, I show you the last man. And this is the last man talking. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? Thus asks the last man, and he blinks. Kind of like deer in the headlight kind of deal. The earth has become small, and on it hops the last man, who makes everything small. His race is as ineradicable as the flea beetle. The last man lives the longest. Like you can't, after the apocalypse or the nuclear apocalypse, the roaches will still live. So the last man, you can't kill the last man because they don't risk anything to themselves. So if you don't take any risks, you don't have any danger of dying. We have invented happiness, say the last men, and they blink. They've left the regions where it was hard to live, but for one needs warmth. One still loves one's neighbor and rums against him, for one needs warmth. And he continues and says, one still works, for work is a form of entertainment, but one is careful lest the entertainment become too harrowing. One no longer becomes poor or rich. Both require too much exertion. Who wants to rule? Who will obey? Both require too much exertion. No shepherd and one herd. Everybody wants the same. Everybody is the same. And whoever feels differently goes voluntarily into a madhouse. What does Nietzsche mean by this last man scenario? Again, it's the diagnosis of the motley cow aspect of modernity. It's apathy. And it's mediocrity. Or maybe it's mediocrity. I think they're both words. I'll have to look that up. But anyway, what do I mean by apathy and mediocrity? Just doesn't care about anything anymore. Going back to those Greeks, for Nietzsche, of course he doesn't think that the Greek gods are real. He doesn't think any gods are real. But he says, but the interesting thing about classical humanity is that their beliefs, though fictitious, were the means through which they overcame themselves. Because they projected something beyond themselves, they set an ideal. He likes to talk about the Greek religion. Of course, remember, he was a philologist, he was a classicist, so he knew quite a bit about it. And he said the thing about the Greek gods is he says, unlike Christianity, who sees God as this fundamental other, it's part of the very Nicene Creed that was established back in the 4th century when they were, codifying the basic doctrines of Christianity, that human beings are non-consubstantial with God. What does that mean? God is fully other. We do not share God's essence. Yes, we're made in his image, but it's an image that is only an analogy or a likeness, a faint resemblance. God is wholly other than human beings. But think about the Greek gods. They're kind of just the ideals of themselves. Hercules, half god, half man, super duper powerful. Zeus was wholly like, human looking, right? But they were basically just the ideal types of human beings. They were the ideals that the Greeks set before themselves, such that they strived to emulate those ideals. But if you can never be like God, because God is wholly other than you, then it's kind of like you just view yourself through a lens of bad. Since I can never achieve, be Christ-like. Well, I can't, because Christ was kind of like God, I can try, but I'm always going to do what? I'm always going to fall short. And if I'm always going to fall short, why should I even try? Not so much that I want to be bad, but why be good? Why bad? Both require too much exertion. And if the gods have died, why do anything anymore? Again, what I was getting at with the whole Greek comparison is that despite the fictions of the gods, as Nietzsche sees it, it was an ideal that we can strive for. But in the wake of the death of God and the nihilism that Nietzsche thinks is on the brink of human existence, then we don't really have anything to strive for except contentment, happiness. Not that it's bad to be happy, but if the only thing you care about is being happy, we're not really going to achieve a lot of great things. What about art? What about like great societies and cultures, things like that? Nietzsche's thinking about the greatness of the Romans, the Greeks, the Renaissance. What's great about modernity? Like, what is our lasting legacy? The iPhone? A thing that we can stare at for hours and just do nothing? That's a bummer. And Nietzsche says it's all part of the nihilism of modernity. So the choice is revaluation exemplified in the image and the ideal of the Ubermensch. The revaluation for the purposes of life affirmation to restore the capacity of human greatness, or the nihilism in simply doing nothing. Maybe we believe, maybe we don't believe. If we believe, it's not with the same fervor as we once did. If we don't believe, it's okay because we just don't believe in anything. In either case, who cares? Doesn't matter. Obviously, Nietzsche's on this side, right? And so Zarathustra is, essentially a work that is a bunch of speeches to try to motivate people to choose the more life affirming side. I'll go through quickly one more speech because we only got a few minutes left, but this is actually quite important. It's near the end of I believe the second handout that I gave you guys. I can't remember. How many did I give you? And I ended up giving you like 4. Maybe, okay, so this is the third handout. Sorry. I know that I had a bunch of readings, but I couldn't remember how I broke them up. But this is the one, this is the beginning of the third handout because I included this at the beginning of the collection from Beyond Good and Evil. Okay. So this is the beginning of the third handout, page 225. One of Zarathustra's speeches called Self-Overcoming, on self-overcoming. And I just want to think about this a little bit because Nietzsche here not only is thinking about the importance of self-overcoming, which is tied up with the whole idea of overcoming humanity, overcoming that which is in yourself that is not yourself, all of these traditional values that are life-negating, leading to nihilism, leading to apathy and all that. But it's also a little bit more on what the history of philosophy truly is for Nietzsche. So I'll close with that. But he says, will to truth. You who are wisest call that which impels you and fills you with lust. A will to the thinkability of all beings. This I call your will. You want to make all being thinkable, for you doubt with well-founded suspicion that is already thinkable. That it should yield and bend for you. Thus your will wants it. It shall become smooth and serve the spirit rather as its mirror and reflection. That is your whole will, you who are wisest, a will to power. When you speak of good and evil too, and evaluations, you want to create the world before which you can kneel. That is your ultimate hope and intoxication. There's a lot there. What is he saying? Philosophy has always progressed under a certain kind of banner, and that banner Nietzsche is calling the will to truth. If you talk to or read, right, I guess, the works of Plato and see, Socrates as our ideal figure in Plato's philosophy, and most of the other philosophers that we've looked at, Kant or Descartes or any of those guys, particularly the big metaphysical philosophers. What would they say? Look, I'm not just making this stuff up. I seek only objective and disinterested truth. My philosophy touches upon truth with a capital T. Nietzsche says, no, it doesn't. And it never even tried to do that. That is the facade that you cling to. But really what you want is to, and consider, his language here, you want to make all being thinkable, for you doubt with well-founded suspicion that it is thinkable, that it should yield and bend for you. Thus your will wants it, and serves spirit as its mirror and reflection. As he puts it in Beyond Good and Evil, every great philosophy is not a will to truth, but in fact a personal confession of its author. Every philosophy is a prejudice of the philosopher itself. And that prejudice, remember, what did we say earlier for Nietzsche? Every truth claim is a value claim. So when we read the philosophy of, say, Plato, we're not really learning about truth. What are we learning about? Plato. We're learning the psychology of the philosopher. And what is the psychology of Plato? This world, bad. What's good? The beyond. If they live in, let's say, somebody like Plato got picked on when he was a kid, or his best buddy Socrates got executed by the Athenians. He says, well, you know what? This world is pretty rough, but what I'm going to do? I'm going to create a second and a distinct world where the philosophers will rule and everyone else will obey. I see a world of suffering, but I'm going to create a world where the last will be first and the first will be last. I negate this world in order to create a second one where my rules are going to stand and everybody else who doesn't listen to me is going to suffer. So, and he says, like, the philosophy is a mirror. It's really, you think like, oh, I'm getting to the true nature of things, but you're just projecting your own, what he calls will to power onto things. Philosophy for Nietzsche is an attempt for the philosopher. By the way, ironically, one wonders if this critique can apply to Nietzsche himself. It is the will of the philosopher that is attempting to imprint itself onto reality. Rather than getting to truth, it wants reality to bend to its will, and ultimately will influence the people that follow it. The unwise, of course, the people, they are like a river on which the bark drifts, and in the bark sit the valuations, solemn and muffled up. Your will and your valuations you have placed upon the river of becoming, that image, again, of the river of becoming. And what the people believe to be good and evil, that betrays to me an ancient will to power. The philosophers kind of get off on the notion that they're influencing so many people, that they are believed, that they impose their values onto not only most people, but all of posterity, that they get to construct moral valuations that betray their own valuations. And most of the philosophers for Nietzsche, and he does say this, by the way, are basically sick, twisted little men who are just sort of weird and inept. I mean, it's sort of like the kid that wasn't very good at football, so they, find a way to be mean to the football players anyway. Sort of like, a warrior coming across a little weakling of their tribe, and they're like, well, you're not really contributing very much to the tribe, so I guess we're just going to have to eat you. And they said, oh, but don't eat me because that'd be bad. And the warrior, kind of dumb, why would it be bad for me to eat you? Well, have you ever considered the fact that your soul may actually live on beyond this life and go to a second life? No. Well, haven't you ever considered that maybe if you eat me, it would be bad and you would be punished in a second life? Really? How do you know this? And then they do some philosophical wizardry. And it's like, ooh, smart things hurt brain. We shouldn't hurt little weak thing. We should listen to weak thing. What if philosophy was a way for weaker types of people in order to gain power over the more simple-minded, strong people, because they didn't have brawn on their side, but they had brain? But insofar as that's the case, they make weak values the stronger values and warps the stronger types into thinking that they owe something to the weaker types. What if morality is just like a weird, twisted game through which weaker types of people end up gaining a lot of power? I don't know. But the point is that for Nietzsche, much of philosophy, history, and morality, he thinks, is ultimately a kind of a prejudice, and that prejudice betrays one particular value, and that value is a hostility to life itself. And so we, of course, according to Nietzsche, need to critique and reevaluate and basically dismantle much of our traditions and take it not just out of society, because his project isn't one that's merely like a grand scale project, but remember, it's an individual project. Overcoming yourself, looking at the eternal recurrence as an ideal that you strive for. And only once you've worked on yourself can you begin to, well, maybe impact the rest of society in the hopes that we move towards something more like Ubermensch as opposed to the last man. But anyway, I guess that's it for Nietzsche. Does it all make kind of sense? As you can see, Nietzsche's pretty hardcore. Which is why he's fun to read and think about. And even if we don't take him all the way, he makes a lot of challenges. He gives us a lot of challenges and a lot of important things, I think, to think about. And his impact on 20th century philosophy and thought is immeasurable. You can see that in many ways he was very prescient to the coming century. But anyway, I guess I'll not see you again. Have a good break. Be safe and careful. Remember, the exam through Blackboard will be available on, by Saturday morning. If you have any questions about anything, please let me know, and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. Okay? You also have the Nietzsche PowerPoints to supplement these discussions. I highly recommend you look over those. You got your Kant dictionary. You've got the study guide. You got Kant PowerPoints. You got a lot of stuff available. All right, so I would, look through all that stuff and prepare and knock the exam out, and then you're done. All right, I'll see you guys. Final grades will be posted by December the 2nd. Wait a minute. Yes, no, that's right. After Thanksgiving. Maybe before, but I'm just saying by then.